you all for coming out here. As you know, there's a great relationship between AWS and startups. Yeah, it's something that goes back really to the earliest days of when we launched AWS. Really, when we were thinking to build these services that would drive sort of internet scale businesses. And I like to believe that what we see today is that many of our new household names are actually startups. You know, whether it's the Airbnbs or the Ubers or the Dropboxes of this world, all of them have grown up on the cloud. Now, I'm very fortunate that we have a great panel here today that's ready to discuss some of the current trends in startups. Yeah, and so I'd like to invite you to introduce yourselves. Ben, why don't you start?
Sure. My name is Ben Whaley. I'm fortunate enough to have been invited by Amazon to be in the Community Hero program. I'm a technology consultant and I work a lot in the security space. So I live in the Bay Area, my consultancy is based there, and I spend a lot of time working with Bay Area startups. And so I'm really happy to be here with this group of people.
Okay. Tracy.
I'm Tracy D'Annunzio. I'm the CEO and founder of Tradesy. We are a peer-to-peer marketplace for women's fashion, where women can buy and sell anything from their closets.
You can say, excuse me.
And I'm also very happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy. Jason.
I'm Jason Seitz. I'm a partner at Techstars. We run a bunch of startup accelerators, and we're a venture investor, engineer by background, and entrepreneur, and happy to be here.
Jason, you really run an accelerator that's focused on cloud technologies.
Yes, we have a vertical program called Techstars Cloud that's focused all on hosting and infrastructure companies, supremely relevant to folks that are here. Yeah.
Okay. Michael.
Michael D'Angelo, I'm the Deputy CIO for the state of Washington, and we do quite a bit with trying to help startups get into government in terms of government as a customer, and also looking at ways we can help support startups and in their ventures as well.
So there is clearly a trend towards public sector being willing to consider younger businesses with their products.
Oh yes, absolutely. Not only as a source of talent, but also an opportunity for government to transform itself by leveraging the skills and abilities that exist in a lot of startups.
Okay. So are there particular, let's say, accelerator programs that are being run, or is it really more individual investments?
It's, we partner with a lot of startup hubs and reach out to them to identify, well, one, to kind of send our message that we're looking at doing businesses with startups and make them aware that government actually is a viable, customer. And then we also make efforts to make it easier to do business with them so we can bring in that talent. So it's sort of individual efforts, get contracts in place and just sort of help them. Yeah.
Jason, accelerators.
Yes.
Definitely the hottest thing in terms of creating newer businesses.
You've heard of them.
I've heard of them, yes. Is it possible today to start a business without actually starting off in an accelerator?
Of course it is. Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the principles that we believe in Techstars is that you can start a business anywhere, right? Both geographically and in any industry. There's no barrier. This is the one we happily live in the startup world in the one little section of reality where the only barrier between you doing something and not doing it is you attempting it, right? There's no gatekeepers. There are no pathways that are required. And we see businesses form in the middle of rural Iowa, right? Certainly, I think there's lots of resources at accelerators, and it's a well-trodden path at this point. And it's certainly not the wrong way to do it, But I would encourage any startup to think about what's the right way for them to start the business that they want to build. A lot of times that may be a startup accelerator, and it could be moving to the Bay Area, but it doesn't have to be.
So how many of your founders are sort of first-time founders?
Initially, so we are, I guess, an 8-year-old organization, and started out running one program a year in Boulder, Colorado, for 10 companies at a time, so very small scale. And back then, it was very high. It was 90%, 95% of the founders were first-time entrepreneurs. Now we run about 18 programs a year, So we have 200 plus companies that will go through one of our accelerators, and we're starting to see more serial entrepreneurs feel the benefit of both the reach of the network that we have and some of the connectivity we can provide. And now I would say that range, maybe 15 to 20%, a fifth of the companies that go through our programs have people that have built business startups before.
Tracy, did you start in the accelerator, or did you do it yourself?
I did. Well, a little of both. I started a business that was a precursor to Tradesy in 2009, and I built it up at my kitchen table, and I actually rented out my bedroom on Airbnb and slept on my couch to finance it for those first few years. And once I had a little bit of data and proof of concept, I applied to an accelerator program. It no longer exists, but it was called Launchpad LA, and it was a Techstars affiliated program, and it was wonderful. I think that one of the biggest values that an accelerator can provide to you is to prepare you to deal with the venture capital community. If your intention is to build a business in which you need to raise large amounts of capital to grow and compete, I entered that accelerator not even knowing what VC stood for, and I left with Series Seed funding and a network of investors that would go on to support our business as it grew.
So Ben, how was it to start your own business? Have you always done that, or is that something that you really picked up on lately?
I've always been a pretty independent person. I'm not very good at having a boss. And so for me, it made a lot of sense from early on to branch off and start working on my own thing. I've worked for a bunch of startups, and I learned a lot from them. And I've taken my experiences there, and now I try to share it with other startups as a consultant in the technology space.
So your customers are mostly other startups? Is that it?
Mostly startups, some enterprise as well, but also startups around the Bay Area.
So how do you find your customers?
Networking, I go meet up, events like this are a big way for me to meet new people, and also meetups around the Bay Area. I think that's one of, California, and in particular in Silicon Valley's strongest points is that there are so many technology experts there, and you can go to a meetup every night of the week. You could be completely exhausted. And so it's actually very easy right now to drum up a lot of business.
So, Tracy, if you think about talent, I think probably each and every one of you has probably to deal with this. How do you recruit? How do you hire the best people? Because there must be an enormous competition for talent around.
It's a brutal war for talent out there, and so our recruiting strategy is to ensure that, so particularly for engineers, to ensure that the engineers that are on our team are incredibly challenged, incredibly happy, and feel really well supported to move up very, very quickly and learn very, very quickly. And then they help us recruit the next generation. That plus an intern program, because getting engineers in young while they're still in school lets you kind of mold them and train them to be really organically part of your team. That's working really well for us, but make no mistake, like if you do not run an organization with a tremendous amount of integrity where engineers are very happy to come to work every day, you will lose based on your inability to recruit talent. It's intense.
Jason, do you have any best practices for hiring that you advise your startups?
For hiring?
Yeah. For finding talent?
Yeah, I'll give you actually some semi-generic advice that I give to the very earliest stage companies. So when we're talking about 2 people or 3 people or 5 people. And it's also advice that I'll give to single founders or hopeful single founders that are looking for co-founders to start a business, which is still a search for talent, right? Which is that it's really easy to build in your mind a hypothetical model of the individual that you're seeking. And there's usually a pretty big gap between that ideal and the people that you actually can access today. And so what I usually would recommend to people is if I held a gun to your head today and I said, look, you cannot leave this room until you write 10 names on a piece of paper of people that you already know that you think you can come in and help you and do this role, you could put 10 names on a piece of paper. In other words, the challenge is to think about not the hypothetical network that you don't yet have, but the people that you already know that can come and fulfill those roles. And I think in a really small company, because it's so much of a mission-based, you're buying in for equity, right? Like at that level. And you have to believe in the upside of the company, and you need people to really put 100% of their life and their soul into the company, and your personal relationships with those individuals in many respects trumps raw experience or skills or talent. And so focusing on how you're attracting people that are like-minded and want to buy into the mission that you can work with, and thinking about it from that frame versus a pure skill and talent frame.
Okay. Michael, any advice there? What are the kind of things that you were saying? Is it actually easier in Washington to hire than in the Valley, do you think? Or is it just as hard?
Well, I'd like to start by first saying, I think, Ben, you're totally rocking that jacket.
I know, look at that thing.
We all voted for this.
He felt unsure if he could pull it off, but what do you think? Can you pull that off, right? Ask him about his band.
This is a very serious conference.
As an insulator.
I know.
That thing is so hot.
Yeah, they reflect heat back in. It's amazing.
But that is cool.
Well, back to the question you had asked. Well, certainly for government, it's really hard to hire, and particularly in Washington, because we're essentially a competitor for the same talent, and we can't compete as a government. We really can't compete on equity or on compensation, and so we have to have a different value proposition. And in particular in Seattle, what makes it difficult is, Seattle's a mecca for talent, which draws even more talent there. But we're competing with Amazon and Microsoft and Disney and Google and Valve and Expedia, a bunch of really big name brands. So it's hiring the top talent and acquiring that top talent is super, super difficult. And it's actually across government, across the country. It is now, in fact, next week is a meeting of national state CIOs. And it is for the first time ever, recruitment retention is the #1 priority for government. And it's because of that challenge. And within the state of Washington, there's a lot of things that we're doing as an employer to be more competitive. And part of the problem is that as a government, our value proposition is that we used to have just is no longer relevant. I mean, we used to compete on the value proposition that we had better benefits, which that's no longer true. And then the other part of value proposition was that if you came to government, you can get a job for life. Well, no one wants a job for life. No one cares anymore. So it's basically irrelevant. The one piece of our value proposition that's still relevant is we have a mission that's really about making a positive impact in the community around you, and that's still something that's pretty unique to government. So there's a movement afoot in government to change our value proposition. It's actually in Washington State, it's one of the governor's top initiatives in the sort of the state efficiency category of things. And it's about changing the workplace culture. And so part of, I talked earlier about our involvement and engagement in startups and small businesses. Part of that is to bring in that culture and to influence inside of state government and change essentially the external brand of government. So when people think of government, hopefully what they'll think of in the future is government, you actually get an awesome mission, you get an opportunity to access technology that very few people have an opportunity to really touch. It's actually a great place, a fun place, you're fully empowered, and to make a really competitive, a competitive value proposition. So I guess the advice I would give is, I think at the end of the day, nowadays what's really relevant is going to be the culture of the organization. I think the culture is essentially the new business leader imperative.
So what we've seen it in many of our public sector customers, especially in DC, is that there is forever government technology has never been considered to be sexy. Yeah, and as such you're attracted to sort of a traditional IT workers. But we see recently with the technology fellows that have been brought into DC, that sort of the Silicon mindset approach, bringing many of people that actually have come from the Valley into government to really change things. Is that something that you guys are looking for as well?
Yeah, actually the federal government, one of the programs they offer is 18F, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's essentially bringing in some of that top talent. So certainly in the state of Washington, we're looking at modeling that. But the idea that government technology isn't sexy, if that's a belief, you don't know actually what's in government technology. No. So in government, it's super sexy.
I said considered.
It's way sexy. So it's sexy because we get into things, like you said, that most people don't get into. So we have underwater vehicles that are collecting data on the different aquatics. We use drones to to monitor oil spills and to monitor or to evaluate incidents, accidents, and that sort of stuff. We get into SCADA systems. There isn't a piece of technology hardly that exists in the world today that doesn't exist in government. And it's largely because government operates in so many different domains. Government, you're working in the healthcare as one sector. And there's a set of technology that's unique just to healthcare. You get in technology, we have another sector around natural resources. So there's a whole series of technology just around natural resources. And then you also have education, and you've got these other disciplines. So there is no private business that has that diversity of sectors that they operate in. And as a result, as a technologist in government, you have exposure to so much, and it's really pretty easy to move across. It's actually a value proposition that most people really don't. Well, one, we don't do a good job communicating it, and then two, most people really don't know it.
Do you see a room for accelerators that are purely focused on public sector, Jason?
I do. We don't have any currently, but it is something we've actually thought about and talked about some. There are lots of opportunities. So the way that we operate, we do kind of the generic, tech accelerator, but we also do have these vertical focused accelerators, and thinking about government through kind of a vertical lens, with some specific use cases. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Do you have public sector as your customers?
I don't currently. I have worked with them in the past, actually. I've worked with, I was in Boulder, and I know a bunch of the folks at Techstars, and so I was working with the state of Colorado there, and also the city of Boulder, because they're in our backyard at the time, in the county of Boulder, and they do have a real talent acquisition problem there. They were not able to attract the kind of talent they need to run the programs that you were just talking about, Michael. There really is a lot of interesting technology out there, and it seems like something you could almost use as a sales tool to recruit folks, as long as you can kind of change the brand, which you already mentioned before. Earlier we were talking, and the word brand came up, and I think my response was there's brand and there's brand ed. Right? And government sometimes is brand ed, and it'd be really nice to turn it into a sales tool instead.
The engineers that I know love hard problems, and I can't imagine a harder challenge or more exciting challenge than getting into government and trying to modernize it to catch up with the private sector and to leverage all of the data that it has. So I talk about our data sets and how exciting and challenging it is to try and analyze what we have is basically a very broad spectrum of user-generated content, which turns out to be unstructured data that we attempt to structure. Well, government has that in spades. I mean, I'll tell you my sales pitch, and it would apply really, really nicely to government as well. I think it's very sexy, if that counts for anything.
But is it? Well, look at that. But is it hard to do business with the government? Harder than doing business with, let's say, other private companies?
Well, I think so from the government perspective. That's been my experience. The difficulty, the first difficulty in doing business with government, particularly as a small business, is government has a mandate effectively to provide an equal opportunity sort of playing field for vendors in the space to be able to compete. The problem is it's a sort of a ring that includes big companies as well as small companies. So it's really featherweights fighting against heavyweights, and it just isn't fair. And large companies can make big investments in entire divisions of the organization that know how to respond to requests for proposals, if you will. In small companies, it's maybe 2, 3, 5 people, and they have no idea. So it's really difficult. Although the intent is to be equal and fair, the on-the-ground reality is it's an unfair competition. There are some things that we're doing in the state of Washington to try to mitigate that, and one of them is to create a different sort of marketplace where essentially to get a contract in government, all you need to do is essentially create a click-through agreement. So you go to a website, you tell us about your company, there's a minimal set of contractual terms, and you accept that as a click-through agreement, and boom, you're able to do business in government. So the whole point there is to lower the barrier to entry, so that the barrier to entry in government, so that the big companies don't have a competitive advantage against small companies.
Cool. Jason, one of the strongest point of accelerators is mentoring.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think you Techstars have a unique story in how many mentors you bring in front of many of your customers. Is that how you call them, or participants, or?
Yeah,
or
we do
whatever?
think of startups as our customer. They're certainly we are optimizing for them, right? So that's they're the customer in our equation, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So do you have people from public sector being mentors, or is it mostly all private companies?
It's by and large people from the private sector. I mean, the archetype of our most common mentor in one of our programs is a startup, is a founder, an entrepreneur who's built businesses because they have the scar tissue around doing this hard thing of building something that didn't exist before. We also have mentors that have specific knowledge and expertise that's useful. You know, and sometimes they're found in large companies, sometimes they're found, in startups, right? But they have a functional role versus a founder role. You know, I will, thinking back of any cases I can surface, one that I know that we had actually in the cloud program, kind of a random mentor, is UKTI, which is the United Kingdom. It's an organization. It's part of the, their kind of exporting and importing of business strategy, and like that UKTI, part of the UK Consulate General specifically tries to facilitate companies doing business from the US into the UK and vice versa. And because we have so many international companies we're working with, and it just seemed like an interesting touch point, and they were trying to figure out how to be supportive of early stage ecosystem, and so UKTI has been an interesting one for us. And maybe also worth noting, one of the founders of Techstars, Jared Polis, is a congressman in Colorado, so we have some kind of connectivity at federal level from our genesis as well.
So there's a real proliferation of accelerators today.
Yeah.
You guys must be competing for startups to enter your program. Do you feel that there's competition among the accelerators?
There absolutely is, but as I already kind of mentioned, one of the interesting things about startups is there's no barrier to there being more of them, right? It's a mental barrier for more people just to attempt to build something that didn't exist. And the more that, and our philosophy on this is that building companies, building startups is a modeled behavior. Most people that take that leap have been close to and observed someone else who's done it. And it's not, and the interesting thing about it being modeled is that it's not inspirational. It's almost exactly the opposite of inspirational. It'd be easy to meet someone who started a company like Amazon or Google and think, wow, like it'd be great to do something like that. But the gap between where you are today and there is too large. What works much, much better is for you, someone that you went to school with, someone that used to work with in corporation, starting a company, and you think to yourself, if that bozo can do it, and that actually is much more effective in getting people to take the plunge and realize that it seems much riskier than it is at the beginning stages of starting a company. And so from that respect, the more accelerators that we have, the more modeled experiences that we're creating, and the more opportunities for people to see what that world is like and to get drawn into it. So,
Tracy, did you get recruited towards for an accelerator, or was it? What was your decision criteria to decide where to start your business?
So I was not the typical founder moving into the accelerator phase story, but I'll tell you, my decision was that at the time, Launchpad LA was giving $50,000 to every incoming startup, and at the time I thought that I could build Tradesy for $50,000. I was wrong.
One of those two statements was true.
One of those two statements was true, and so I went to interview kind of blind, and I didn't have any connections to the community, so I was not being recruited, and I was a little bit of a wild card for them. For that reason, one thing I will say is that I do think that more accelerators benefits the ecosystem in general, but two things about that. One is that you will be judged for the rest of the lifetime of your company on everything you've done, including which accelerator you attended, and some are better than others. So it's worth taking time to do diligence and see which of your local accelerators is putting out companies that actually succeed. because it's not an accident which ones are and aren't, and you'd be much better positioned from an accelerator that has a history of success in networking their companies to the next level. And then the other thing is that you don't necessarily, again, have to join an accelerator, but it does exactly what it says. It accelerates the process. For me, I did not have a network of investors that I could go to and talk to about what I wanted to do next, and that's what the accelerator gave me. So I would say be really selective about it, and no, I was not recruited, but I think they're glad that they let me in, although they just barely let me in.
I'm sure they
how important is the sort of the old boys network from a particular accelerator or old girls network, whatever you want?
It's semi-important. If you don't have connections, then you need to have proof that what you're doing is working on some level. So it's important, but it's not impenetrable. So if you don't have those connections, you can go out and make them like I did, and you even get the opportunity to do something that matures a little bit before you meet those people, which is great. So I think that, I think that the issue with the proliferation of accelerators is that there are a bunch of charts that show, and I don't recall the numbers offhand, but that there's a big delta now between the companies that get accelerator and seed funded to the Series A, and fewer are making the leap because there's so much capital available at the early stage and less capital available in the old boys club as you go up the chain through subsequent rounds. So when you get those early investments, whether it's 50,000 from an accelerator or a seed round, you've got to put them to work quickly and make sure it's effective, because at the next level of competition, the odds get slimmer and slimmer every time.
So Ben, when you work with younger businesses, how easy is it to convince them that security should be their top priority these days?
Yeah, it depends a little bit on the business. One of my favorite startups that I've worked with is Coinbase, and of course they're a heavy AWS user, and they take security really seriously. As you might know, Bitcoin is a little bit of a dangerous currency, and so they spend a lot of time and effort thinking about it. It's, I would say, their top priority. And what is really special is that they then go and share this with a bunch of other startups around the Bay Area at meetups. And I learned a lot from them as a result of that. And you get to go to other startups and share it with them, and that everybody takes it a little more seriously. In recent years, of course, security has become, the profile of security has increased a lot as well. So working with Coinbase, I think they have such a presence in the Bay Area of security that it brings it to mind for everyone else around.
But security must be really important in the federal government, or in the state and federal governments as well. So do you hire specialists for that, or do you expect your talent to be, let's say, more generalists, but also take security serious?
Yeah, security comes up. We do a combination of a lot of different things, and the security at a government level is kind of different. It's not only, you're not only concerned about application security, but there's also, you worry a little more about the, sort of the threats from other countries really attacking a government, U.S. government, and a lot of times they'll attack the U.S. government through, through the states or local governments. And in Washington in particular, we have a abnormally high, set of threat factors, largely because it's surprising how many people don't realize in the world that Washington, there's actually a state called Washington, and there's Washington, D.C. So, there's...
Have you considered rebranding?
Yeah, that's right. We're going to change the name of the state. Nothing to see here. So we have a particularly extra challenge when it comes to that. And part of it is, we do, hire top talent, of course. And talent is drawn towards governments because security is such a much more complex kind of issue. But it's also, particularly thinking of Amazon, I mean, Amazon, or using Amazon services for us, is actually a security strategy. And so it's looking at leveraging vendor partnerships to essentially offset certain types of security problems so that we can focus on ones that are unique to our particular set of business. So, and I think that's a growing trend. where governments are going to, they just can't. We just cannot make the investments that, investments that Amazon can make with respect to security. I mean, because it's not a legislative win. A legislator's not going to, champion in front of the public that we're going to spend $10 million, on cybersecurity, which nobody understands what the heck that is, and they're worried about, starving babies and other things and roads, and so it's just a no-win situation from a political perspective. So leveraging vendor partners is a big part of our strategy.
Interesting, Michael. If I may, what really brings it, I think, to the forefront of mind is there have been a few incidents out there and that have just crushed the business. They have a security incident. Everyone's example, I think, is Code Spaces. If you're familiar with that one, that their credentials were compromised and the attacker deleted everything in their account, held it hostage essentially. And so that kind of incident is something that I find myself pointing to and say, this is why you need to take security seriously. We're finally coming around to the point where people are realizing maybe AWS is doing data centers more securely than we can do it ourselves. It's not our core competency. And so I think that it used to be this perception, especially with government, that cloud is not secure. And I think that that's changed. I think it has a ways to go, but I think it's headed in the right direction.
Yeah, I wouldn't say past tense changed. I think it's at the sort of the cusp of beginning to change.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, also, I mean, security, of course, is really important. So in your business, Tracy, does security play a role for you?
Yeah, it sure does. I mean, so we don't store credit card information ourselves, which allows us to have, like, we were more relaxed until recently. We just made our first security hire, and
that made you less relaxed.
Well, yeah, he did make me less relaxed because, but I think that the general trend and what I hear from other CEOs is that we've all become aware in the last year or year and a half that we've not been taking proper security precautions. And we've also become more and more aware that breaches will happen even if we take precautions. So the name of the game is probably reducing the risk and knowing that we're not going to be able to completely eliminate the risk. And frankly, it's very scary, and it's also an additional expense. But I will say we did an audit and had several security experts, and we're doing all right, and AWS is helping us do all right. So. Okay,
well, so you said you indeed hired dedicated people to actually look after security. Coming back, Jason, to sort of the talent. I mean, is there a shift? I mean, in the past we would look for this one back-end developer that basically could do everything, the full stack. But now with, what is it, close to 50 services that AWS delivers, no longer one single individual can actually manage all of them, manage and monitor all of that. Do you see a trend towards where there's more individual specialized talent that actually also go to startups?
Sure, yeah. I mean, definitely technology has a way of becoming increasingly specialized. It always has, right? So this is just a continuance of a trend that's existed for a very long time. But at the origin of launching a startup, it's still usually just 2 or 3 people, and so those people do have to be generalists in the truest and broadest sense of the word. And at the accelerator level, we tend to be dealing more with that generalist mindset. What I would say we're seeing is that first rounds of funding, whether it's seed round or Series A, you have a laundry list, Noah's Ark of animal types that you have to go hire now to fill out the tech bench because of how complex the landscape is at this point. So yeah, the specialization is definitely happening.
Is security something that you talk about with your customers? Because it's almost impossible to retrofit security into something that you have already built.
Yeah.
So it almost needs to be there from the ground up.
This is something Ben and I actually were talking about a little bit, and my question to him, was when you look at the curve of technology and just the power of the tech that we're creating, and then you look at the kind of the curve of the security proficiency, and our ability to actually manage the risks, and the increase in risk relative to advanced persistent threats, overseas attackers or whatever. You know, the more that all of our infrastructure is automated and that everything is connected, we're actually amplifying the risk of that security of a security issue. And my take on that is that where the real gap is, you know, I think the security industry historically has considered this to be a lot of education gap. You know, like how do we teach developers to design better systems with a security mindset from the beginning? How do we educate users to have more secure behaviors? But those are human problems, and human problems are actually pretty hard to, you know, biology is hard to overcome. My opinion is that it's a tool gap. And I think that the race of those two curves, that the challenge for us in the room and for people that are trying to build infrastructure like AWS is to build better and more secure tools for creating better and more secure systems. And so I think that you know, not that we should give up on trying to educate engineers to design with a security mindset at the beginning, but I think there's a tool gap. We need tools that build better software.
But also, I do think that education plays a very important role in this.
Hugely important.
I want to make a plug for something that I mentioned in my keynote this morning as well. We've created a framework called the AWS Well-Architected Framework. And security, reliability, performance, and cost are sort of the 4 pillars in there. But also it really comes with, let's say, the 10, 15 questions around security that you should ask yourself when you're building something on top of AWS. You know, how do I manage my credentials? Where do I store my data? Which of my data needs to be encrypted and things like that. So wanted to make a plug for that.
Yeah.
If you really, because that sort of knowledge about how to well architect things on top of AWS is not easily shared, and we hope that by this we can share.
And I would echo one point, and this may be on the list, but that Tracy made, which is coming up with your incident response plan ahead of time.
Stuff will happen.
Right, because something will happen, and what actions do you take immediately, and how do you think about containing issues when they happen? It's an important part of thinking about the security posture.
Yeah. Ben, do you consider yourself to be a generalist or are you a specialist?
Boy, it's a big question. I have a full stack background, I think, and it happens, I think, that of all the areas I've worked in, information security is the thing I'm most passionate about because it's so interesting and it moves so quickly. And so I find myself today doing mostly security work and a lot of vulnerability assessment work on the AWS platform because I read this article recently, a really insightful one I thought. It's by, I don't know if you're familiar with BugCrowd. I have no stake in them, but they're a really interesting company that's kind of an outsourced, crowdsourced penetration testing business. And the head of that company, he wrote an article talking about builders versus breakers. And it really takes both to build a secure system, and developers are always builders. They often don't have a background in security. They almost never have a background in networking, and so you bring in somebody to break it, and they push back, and they push the developer, and as a result, the whole team grows. And so this builders versus breakers mentality, if you can bring that, I think, into your business, and just instill a red team, blue team kind of attitude among your developers, I think will help with your security posture overall.
Well, you mentioned already some of the trends like crowdsourcing and things like that. So are there particular trends that you guys are thinking about that are really on your radar where you really want to focus on? Or where you feel that in the sharing economy being one of those things that we've really seen a rise in. So are there particular trends that you guys are seeing? Jason, you must be seeing a lot of companies.
Yeah, so I mean, we have 700 plus portfolio companies in our accelerators. So yes, there are trends. We love them all. So the drones are a trend. Something personally I have a lot of interest in is what's developing in the driverless car, autonomous kind of robotics market. I think there's a lot of really interesting things happening in healthcare. I think sharing economy is going to create a new class of labor in this country, which is really interesting to see how the labor market's going to evolve, and solve a massive problem, the future problem that we haven't yet felt of all of the sideline labor when we build in all of these efficiencies that are being created everywhere else. So I mean, there's every direction we look, there are macro trends that we're interested in from a kind of evolutionary mindset on these different.
Michael, you just mentioned how sexy your whole
Oh yes, it's very
role
sexy.
is. Are there particular trends that you are looking at, that you're investigating or tracking to see what is going to happen in that particular area or world, or do you like everything as well?
Well, I do like a lot. I think the sort of the fun part of government is that you have to know so much about so many things because you're in so many different sectors, and it's a big challenge, but it's also very exciting. And so when you're asking the question about trends, I'm thinking, oh my God, I mean, do I answer that with respect to education, with healthcare, natural research, with technology stacks, or what? But me personally, I'll answer just for me personally. The things that I'm tending to focus on a lot more now is more around the branding stuff that we're doing in government, and because I think government is largely, to be frank, it's largely a monopoly, and so because we provide services that only government can provide, but that also creates a sense of complacency, and if government thought of itself as a private enterprise and it did a SWOT analysis, its biggest threat right now actually isn't security. Its biggest threat is the talent pool. So the biggest threat to the business is the inability to attract and retain talent. So my area of focus as of late has been largely around trying to influence the trends in terms of the branding of government, how to be more clear in terms of what is the value proposition, and to create a new reality for the value proposition of government. And so that's one piece of that. And the other piece is how can we make government more agile and more integrated and leverage the talent and just I guess simply the talent and the breadth of resources really in the startup community. And I guess maybe another trend to think of it is, I think small business is the new big business. And so this notion of leveraging more and more of the skills and expertise that's coming out of these small businesses, and you mentioned it earlier, where you got, the economy is just littered with small businesses that are making big products.
Hugely successful.
Yeah, hugely successful. And governments historically have been pretty dismissive of small businesses and only going to big fives kind of thing. But I see that trend changing. It's changing because government is because citizens, all of us, are expecting our government to behave differently. We're expecting more mobile-enabled services. We're expecting the government to act like the services we get in the rest of our life. And so that's creating a lot of pressure, which is forcing governments to be much more agile and less expensive. And so it's driving governments to think a little bit differently about small business. So I think that's certainly a big trend. And part of the other thing I'm passionate about is, like I said, the workplace culture, which includes changing what the work experience is like in an organization, and not only allowing people to come in to government and have a huge impact because of the mission, but actually empower the workers to make a difference. And so in Washington State, for example, we're piloting Holacracy. We've been running Holacracy for 9 months, when we're the only government in the world actually doing that. And it's all about how do we create an environment, a new culture that is really compelling and changing that brand. So there's a lot of governments, a lot of states are dealing with that issue, and I think it's a trend to kind of shift towards that.
Tracy, what do you see in your peers? What do you see around it? Are there particular trends that you think are really hitting off?
I think two things. I think virtual reality is super exciting. I can't quite imagine it, but I think that in a decade or so it will probably be our primary form of entertainment. Maybe a little more than a decade. I hope a decade. And I've seen some previews of some of the technology that's being developed, and the potential for applications is just mind-blowing. So I look forward to living in a virtual reality world, hopefully sooner than later. And if I were an investor, that's where I'd be investing too right now. I think that we'll see, traditional forms of entertainment, maybe even sites like Netflix, actually having to evolve their businesses to meet a world where virtual reality is far more exciting than a flat screen. And so that's one trend. Another trend that we are, I believe, pioneering is part of the sharing economy in a way, and that is, imagine the sharing economy for goods, right? So what Tradesy does is we enable people to sell their underutilized goods, the things in their homes and closets that they're not getting use out of, and monetize them. And what's happening is that we're seeing a huge trend of sell to buy behavior. So consumers are no longer forced to sort of say, I want this, I have to save up for it, then I'll get it, then it'll live in my home or closet and for all eternity or until I give it away. They're able to say, I want this and I've got this that I don't use that much, let me sell it. And the way I think of it, we were talking about this at lunch, is sort of like before Twitter, we had 10 or 20 news sources. They filtered down the news to all of us. Then Twitter emerged and we found an alternative, which was a horizontal network of information where we could consume information from our peers or from traditional sources. So if you imagine the retail markets are like that as well. What we're creating and what we're seeing people get really excited about and believe is a bona fide trend is a horizontal network that's an alternative to retail that lets all of us who are buyers online become sellers online. And I think that's going to have dramatic implications for how we think about the things we own, how we think about the money we earn, and how we relate to each other in the world. So we're excited about that trend and we're happy to be a part of it.
Ben, any particular insights and trends?
Well, I work with a stealth mode startup in the IoT space. They're based out of Palo Alto, go figure. And I think they're probably pretty excited about AWS's new service in this space. So IoT it's something that for me that's been kind of a buzzword for a long time, and now it's starting to enter mainstream awareness. And so it's really fun to see some of that kind of come to life. So that's one area where I'm spending a lot of time thinking about the security implications of that, or an entire panel of its own. And then the other one that doesn't get a lot of attention, like at a conference like this, is the Bitcoin blockchain is a pretty interesting technology. That's a hardcore engineering kind of space that I think we're only just starting to think about the other applications of the blockchain. And so I'll be interested to see where that goes in the coming few years. Yeah.
Jason, do you see more trends towards young businesses, startups willing to build hardware? I mean, so we've seen a number of them come out,
yes,
out of the accelerators, but building hardware is a lot harder than building software.
It
and
is.
So
it is
a lot of
today.
experience is necessary.
But it's getting easier, and I actually. I'm on the stage, so I'll just do it. I'll plug a company that we invested in that I think is kind of aiming at that problem. It's called MacroFab. And the metaphor that I use for them, how I think about them, is AWS for hardware. And I think that the trend that's happened that you and Amazon created largely over the last decade plus, that's completely changed the way that engineers think about architecting and building products. I think that opportunity exists in hardware as well, and I think we're starting to see that trend. So all of the things that happened to the hosting world in the last 15 years, I think are going to play out in physical goods as well, where you get a decrease in the amount of upfront capital. You end up with utility model on-demand purchasing and creation. You
but
get
manufacturing is
manufacturing on demand, distributed production capacity, and turning what used to be soldering irons and workbenches into software and bits, and that changing the way that designers and engineers and startups and large companies eventually think about actually building and selling and delivering hardware. I'm bracing personally for what I think of as the Cambrian explosion of hardware, which would be awesome. And we're seeing, a bunch of really interesting converging trends. I think that it's actually an exciting time to be building hardware companies, and we're seeing more and more.
Okay.
I think to add on to that a little bit, and sort of trends from a government perspective. One that I did mention, that's related to the hardware, is the sensing, the notion of,
Sure.
it's kind of an internet thing, but it's really about having a lot more sensors around, and where we're using human sensors to know what's going on atmospherically, or we see this a little bit with garages, where you can tell how many slots are available, and some countries do this better than the U.S. We're a little bit behind in many instances, but I think and that's really a hardware type of
Yeah.
problem.
Well, if the IoT vision plays out, who's going to build most of those devices? Startups,
Right.
right? Like these are the people that are imagining all the weird little use cases that we don't see yet, and building a little widget that becomes eventually a giant company.
Right.
But also building open source hardware. And
Totally.
I mean, if I look,
Also,
for example,
yeah.
what the city of Chicago is doing with what's called the array of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they've open sourced the hardware, which are sensors that you can place around town to measure air quality and noise and things like that. So both the platform that they've built in terms of software, they've open sourced it, as well as the design of the sensors and the hardware, where you can just take their blueprint and start building them yourself. So I think open source hardware
Right.
is definitely an interesting trend as well.
Yeah, you know, I worked with a business called Anki in San Francisco, and some of you may have seen out on the expo floor, I think it's the Sophos booth, has like 4 of the Anki tracks with the cars you can race with your phone. And this is one of these blends of emerging technology where it's robotics meets Internet of Things, and there's sensors on these devices, right? The cameras on the bottom of them, and they're all connecting out to the internet. And that was just fantastically interesting application of robotics that we couldn't have even, we couldn't have dreamed that that was going to be possible 5 years ago. When they started building the business, they expected that they were going to have a remote control. And as they started doing it, this was in roughly 2007, I think, and by 2009, they saw the smartphone, and the abilities that it was, that it had, and that was clearly their controller. And so the technology is changing so fast that there's a lot of new things that are becoming out there.
Yeah. And machine learning plays an important role there as well, where how can these devices become more autonomous without actually having to go back to the model source or to have a pilot actually running them. I mean, in our warehouses we have about 15,000 robots that actually these days move shelves to which way you can pick, instead of people actually have to walk for miles and miles in picking goods out of the rack. So it's radically different. We're almost getting, yeah?
I was going to make another point about Anki, in that they have this manufacturing line, and the manufacturing takes place in China, and in the factory, the cars are going down the line getting assembled. They're able to make measurements of the cars and look for defects, and then they can ship it up to the cloud and run predictive analytics on what cars will be defective and make decisions about, well, is that batch going to be good or not? This is another thing that wouldn't have been possible before.
Cool. We were getting almost to the end of the panel. We've asked the panelists to think about one word of advice or one key advice that they would like to give to people in the room, whether you're using cloud or whether you're in startups or not. Is there a particular cool advice that you give? We won't start with Michael because he seems to be surprised.
I know, right? Exactly. Yeah.
Well,
Ben, did you want to start?
I can start if you'd like.
Go ahead.
Okay, and I'm glad you said it's more than one word, because I'm not sure how much advice I can give one word.
A word of advice.
A word of advice, okay, perfect. I guess a couple things, although you said one, but I'm going to change the rules of the game. One is, if you're looking for an awesome place to work, you got to come to Washington, and the number one compelling reason is marijuana is legal. All right, game over.
Got you in California too.
I'm from Amsterdam. There's a reason I moved to Washington.
But I think the main word of advice I'd give is think of government differently. One, they are a potential huge customer if you're in the startup world. Just in the state of Washington alone, in just IT expenditures, we spend $2 billion a year. And that's big dollars. And it's a missed opportunity if you're not thinking of government as a customer. And so that's my main advice.
Cool.
So a question that I get often from an accelerator and venture standpoint is, what do I do how should I optimize my chances of getting accepted into an accelerator? Or a similar question, how do I increase my odds of getting venture investment? And something that advice I'll often give, particularly at the accelerator level, is the most important thing is for you to be authentic and concise. So being true to who you are, what you're building, why you think it matters, instead of trying to play to an image that you think the other person has in their mind of what you should be. I see too many startups feel a compulsion to contort themselves to look like what they expect an investor to see. And really, if you think about the job of the investor or the accelerator on the selection side is trying to figure out what's actually there as quickly as possible. The best way to do this is to figure out how to be yourself and convey that in a packaged way.
How much do you use of your existing network? So one of the advices that I often hear about trying to get into an accelerator is that you have to know others that have been part of that program and more or less can vouch for you.
Sure.
Is that something that you see a lot?
It helps. One of the reasons why it helps, though, is that can get you past the first great filter. So when you think like the great filters of extinction for humanity, like that. So we have thousands and thousands of people that apply, companies that apply to these programs. There is an initial culling that happens because there's only so much time in the day to actually really go and interview and get to know a company, the nuance of it, and you got to figure out how to at least get to that step. Knowing somebody can help you get short-circuited to that step, but it's not the only way. Right, and certainly there are, so I think that the value of knowing somebody is to make sure you get looked at, right? And if you don't have that, then you have to figure out how to be compelling on paper without, to get to that step. And after that, it's just about being yourself. And if it's meant to be, it's meant to be.
Tracy, any words of advice or insight or?
So many from the front lines of startup land, but I would say two things. One is that we live in such an amazing time. So if you're old enough like I am to remember having to go to the library and pull microfiche when you wanted to do a deep dive and research something weird, which is like my secret hobby. So if you remember that, it's incredible that we live in a day and age where all the information you need to build your business is one search away. Or two, and that's how I learned, and I just think it's for me, this access to information that we now live in was a miracle, and I think we should all really appreciate that we're alive at this time. My other advice is something that I think if you are a passionate founder or CTO and you're thinking about your vision and your company, that you should never forget. And that is that the only reason a company ever goes out of business is because it runs out of money. And so for myself, my co-founders, and plenty of other founders that I know, we love operating. But you hear a lot of us talking about how to get VC dollars and how to get into accelerators, and it's like, well, why does this matter? It matters because at the end of the day, in the system that we currently exist under, you go out of business if you run out of money. And your job as a leader is to always be working towards what's going to put dollars in the bank, whether it's your revenue or investment capital, and to always know exactly what your timing looks like for when that money's going away and where you're getting the next bit from. So because this is a visionary panel, I thought I would just inject a little bit of the down-to-earth realities of operating too.
Building a sustainable business that can sustain itself seems
yes,
like
and so if it's about generating net revenue that's going to sustain your business, then you have to always remain focused on that. If it's about accessing investment capital to make a growth play, you have to stay focused on that. But in all this talk, remember, you got to check the bank account every day. That's part of the job of leading a team.
Ben, any advice?
I'm going to share the advice of somebody I really respect, who is Sam Altman, the founder of Y Combinator, a really interesting guy. And he ran a class at Stanford called How to Start a Startup. And so for folks who are interested in startups, you're here, so clearly you're interested in startups. You should check that out. It's super interesting. And what he shares, and what Peter Thiel in that class later goes on to reinforce, is that you should build a business that's very hard to replicate. Right? Build a monopoly. And that's a lot easier said than done. That's a big challenge. But if you build a business that's hard to replicate, then there's not going to be a million competitors that are nipping at your heels all of the time. Or maybe they are, but they're not going to be successful at that. So that's my tip.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you, panelists, for actually taking the time to actually share your experiences with us here. We're very fortunate that you guys have been willing to be on stage here with us today. Thank you all for being here. Please stick around if you want to. At 4:15, we'll have another session where I'll be interviewing individual CTOs. The CTO of DraftKings, Zenavit, Oscar Health, and Poshmark are going to be here on stage. And I'll have conversations with them about how are they using AWS technology. So with that, thank you all for being here, for your attention. Thanks to panelists for being willing to be on stage here with us today.
Thanks.